Okay.
Good evening. So glad to see so many good people here tonight. I'd like to introduce Steve Newton. I work with him at the National Center for Science Education. I know him as a wonderful artist, a wonderful geologist, and historian of note, and just one of the nicest folk I have ever run into.
Oh, thank you.
Tonight, it's Diluvian Daphnis. Thank you.
Steve.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. We're good. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Newton, and I work for the National Center for Science Education. And I also teach across the bay at College of Marin. And one of the things what I teach over there is geology. So the creationist attacks on geology as well as evolution are sort of near and dear to my heart as something to push back against. So what I'd like to talk to you today about is how creationists misrepresent the geology of the Grand Canyon. Scientists know the geology of the Grand Canyon very well. We've studied it for quite a long time. And yet creationists come in with a very, well, their interpretation of the Grand Canyon is as flawed as it is the interpretation of evolution. So I'd like to start with a quote from a rather well-known creationist, John Morse, the son of Henry Morse, who was the guy who wrote Scientific Creationism, sort of launched that movement in the 60s, and the current president of the Institute for Creation Research. John Morse has this to say: geology is the foundation of evolution. Geology is the foundation of evolution because without millions of years to explain the history of the Earth, the evolutionary model falls apart. Now, Darwin is, of course, most well known as being the father of evolution and more known in biology. But what a lot of people don't fully realize is that on the Beagle expedition, as a very young man, some of his most influential things were works such as Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, these books that talked about deep time, these books that put into his head the idea that maybe the Earth is much older than the 6,000 some odd years that everybody just seemed to have assumed. And it's that deep time which then in his mind becomes, well, small modifications over a very long time, very different results. So Charles Darwin, Geologist, is a title that he also takes as well as a founder of evolution. And he was quite a polymath in that regard, fluent in many different subjects. And of course, if you wanted to talk about barnacles, he was your guy. You know, in a way, it sort of reminds me of like the Isaac Newton thing. Like, oh yeah, Isaac Newton, on a break in summer, invented calculus. You know, and then he spent 30 years at alchemy. So, you know, if you want to talk calculus, yeah, maybe he'd be interested. But mostly, he wanted to talk about alchemy. Anyway. So what I want to talk about today is start off a little bit telling you about NCSE's rafting trip and maybe plug that a little bit. And, well, because, you know, we want people to go on this, and it's a great trip. And I want to talk a little bit about a creationist field trip that occurred at 2 sessions of the Geological Society of America annual meeting. And then I'll spend some time talking about what creationists claim about the Grand Canyon and, well, why they're wrong. I rather like this book here. This is a book by Taz Walker called Biblical Geology, Properly Understanding the Rocks. I just think that's a very funny idea to say the only way to properly understand the rocks is through a biblical framework. That's really where a lot of these people are thinking. This is really a mindset that is hard for some people to understand, but once you become familiar with what they're saying, it just sort of all fits in. You can only understand the Grand Canyon through the lens of the Bible. You can only understand evolution through the lens of the Bible. This is a pervasive mindset and one that is really challenging to science and science education. So NCSE's rafting trip is something we do every year. And you all, of course, know Jeannie. If you would like to spend more time with her and me, we take a little over a week here and go down the canyon in one of these large boats. They're about 35 feet long and rubberized and very safe and sane, even though that might look a little dramatic. Most of the rapids in the Grand Canyon really is sort of, if you don't like being splashed with cold water, it's maybe not the right trip for you because you're basically continuously wet, but in a good way because it's like 100 degrees, then you get splashed with this cold water, it cools you off just enough, you start to dry off, and then you get splashed again, and so your temperature regulation is actually pretty nice. It's like a natural air conditioning. And Jeannie and I go down the Grand Canyon looking at rock layers such as these and expounding about why, as I will expound, they show a story of geology. They show a story of what's happened to the Earth. Jeannie, of course, gives the creationist side. In a very tongue-in-cheek way. I'm thinking maybe this year we should play up to this a little bit more and maybe try and, on the first day, say, Jeannie has had a spiritual crisis, and this is she's come to some new realizations. Let's hear what she has to say. Oh no! You never know. I'm not sure that people would actually go for that, so maybe that's a bad idea. Like most of my ideas, a bad idea. So we're running here July 16th to 24th this year. Yes, we are going to the Grand Canyon in the hottest time of the summer, but that just makes the water as it splashes over you all the more enjoyable. So, I'll talk to you about something that's happened at two meetings of the Geological Society of America recently, in 2009 and 2010. In 2009, a group of young Earth creationists, we know them very well at NCSC, a group of young Earth creationists led a field trip to Mount St. Helens. And they love Mount St. Helens because they see in one particular spot of what happened in 1980, the May 18th eruption, they see a channel that was carved very rapidly by this pyroclastic flow that was coming off of the mountain. And they look at that and they say, aha, rapid carving. It's like a mini Grand Canyon. And that's how they say it. This is like a Grand Canyon to a 1/10 scale, which you could say of any stream that's being eroded by water too. It's not that dramatic of a statement. But they did this trip and they did it straight. They didn't say creation. They didn't say slide biblical first. They tried to do it as straight geology. Now, I missed that one, unfortunately. But in 2010, they took another trip to the Garden of the Gods in Colorado, the Garden of the Gods area, which actually has some very beautiful rocks. And these creationists led, here you see it going on here, about 50 geologists at this meeting out into the field, had them look at rocks, and said, to my mind, some very, very interesting things. What they were trying to argue was essentially the Noah's flood model. What they were trying to argue was the same arguments they make about the Grand Canyon. And because Noah's flood was worldwide, those same things they point to in the rocks should be true even in Colorado. And that's the argument they were subtly trying to make. Now, they weren't overt about this. They weren't upfront. One of the main people involved in this, Steve Austin, he was sort of the de facto leader of this trip. He introduces himself as a geologic consultant. Well, that's true. He is a geologic consultant. I mean, it wasn't a fabrication. But there is the additional wrinkle that he's also the head of the geology department for the Institute of Creation Research. And has published quite a number of books about the Grand Canyon from a creationist, catastrophist point of view. Here's one of them. Well, actually, he hasn't published a number of books, but he's certainly published a number of articles collected in this book, Grand Canyon, Monument to Catastrophe. Steve Austin, editor. So I guess other people are contributing as well. So Grand Canyon, Monument to Catastrophe is the book that Jeannie and I bring with us as we go down the river. And she will point out the diagrams and figures and say, look, here, you see this erosional layer? That's when the flood started. And I'll look at that and say, well, not so much. Now, Steve Austin, you can see him here, is identified as a field research geologist with a PhD from Penn State. Quite true. He has a legitimate academic credentials. And senior research scientist with the Institute for Creation Research. Interestingly, I pulled this picture from a place that you might not know about, Creation Wiki. Yes, there is a Creation Wiki, a Wikipedia for creationists. Just as there is a, what's it called? Conservapedia. There's a Wikipedia for conservatives who consider, what's the word I'm looking for? Reality? facts did not quite correspond with their ideas. So darn it, we gotta change the facts so it corresponds with what we already know to be true. Well, likewise, there's a creation wiki which lists is actually very useful for our research. What people are, if they have a new publication or something, they might get on there, kind of do a little research on them. So another person who went on this Garden of the Gods trip in Colorado is another well-known young Earth creationist, a guy named Marcus Ross, who teaches geology at Liberty University, Jerry Falwell's university. And he's kind of an interesting person. You might have seen the face or heard the name before, especially if you read the Times. Back in 2007, Corey Dean had a front page article about this guy as he was receiving his PhD. Here you see there's nothing much unusual about the dissertation, Marcus Ross, yada yada. His subject was the abundance of mosasaurs, and the work was impeccable, but he thinks the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. And he's unabashed about that. Now, the way he explained it in this article was rather interesting. He said, for geologic work, for his dissertation, or for papers to GSA, he works in a mode of standard geologic thinking. But for a creation crowd, he will switch modes and operate in the second mode as a creation scientist. And that's how he explained it in this article. That's how he explained it when he was confronted by this at the 2010 GSA meeting. I mean, he gives a talk, right, a little 15-minute talk like everybody does, and right out of the gate, somebody says, like, how can you possibly say millions of years in that one diagram when we all know you believe 10,000 years? Yeah, it was a little awkward. But I should say not everyone knew that. I mean, some people knew his background. Some people read this. Many people were like, who? What did they say? What's going on? Because he gave a very straight presentation on mosasaurs, talking about millions and millions of years, and never mentioned that he doesn't think that's true. Anyway, so he was also one of the people on this trip. And I was really struck by some of the language that was used during this trip in the Garden of the Gods, and how this then really corresponds to the way they think about the Grand Canyon and elsewhere. One of the things that Steve Austin consistently said was when he'd point to outcrops like this one, he'd say, these rocks are called Cambrian. These rocks are called Permian. These rocks are called such and such geologic unit. I found it very interesting because in a way it gives him plausible deniability. He can say what geologists think, or he can say what geologists use the term as, but he's subtly denying, and well, maybe not so subtly denying, he in writing explicitly denies that he thinks that these rocks are older than 500 million years old. He thinks they're 10,000 years old, much less of an age. So saying something is called Cambrian is kind of the language that they use in describing this. They can fit in, and most of these people are geologists who have no idea what's going on. I think maybe me and I talked to a few people who seemed to get a hint to it, and there were certainly some creationists who went along on this trip as well. But there were, I think the majority of people here went on this trip, left it, and never knew what was actually going on because of these rhetorical subtleties. Called Cambrian rather than simply is Cambrian. It's a subtle rejection of geologic time, and that's one of the main ways that the creationists attack the geology of the Grand Canyon, to deny that it is as old as it is. He would point to these rocks and say, these are the same all over North America. That's kind of a subtle thing. Do you mean exactly the same? Because we could do a study, the rocks side by side, and there's actually quite a lot of difference as you go from one region to another. Most rocks are pretty local. So to say that these rocks are the same thing all over North America is a bit of a stretch. But what the idea here, what the root of this claim is, excuse me, is that these rocks form from rapid deposits that were made during the year of the flood. They think most of the rocks we see around us, certainly most of the flat-lying rocks in the Grand Canyon, are rocks that were rapidly deposited in days and deposited over a continental scale. Not in one localized valley where we have a little sandstone forming. No. In a whole continent-sized sheet. A phrase that came up was a massive marine transgression accounting for these rocks here. And that's a geology fancy speak way of saying a rise in sea level and or a tectonic drop in the continents. You get a transgression, sea level apparently rises over a continent. And that's a real word. I mean, geologists really use that. But I think the massive marine transgression he was talking about was quite different than the one that most geologists are referring to. This worldwide flood is something he's trying to argue in these rocks. There were actually 5 leaders of this trip tried to subtly put in and support their basic idea that everything geologists think about the world is completely wrong. Now, July 2011, I wrote up about this trip for Earth magazine. Creationism creeps into conferences. Yes, I do like alliteration. And that got quite a bit of stir. I found myself on the phone talking to the head of GSA about what their plans were to deal with these sort of issues and qualifications for future field trip leaders. The problem was this was a pretty legitimate field trip. These guys had PhDs. They knew the area. Marcus Ross had done field work out there. So he's basically taking us to our field sites. And they weren't saying anything overtly biblical. They weren't saying anything overtly young earth. I mean, I sort of got it by these rhetorical subtleties, but I think the other 50 people there just right over their heads unless they knew about this issue. So I was very happy to be able to bring to people's attention more knowledge about this issue. So let's talk now about the Grand Canyon in specific. These guys, we find them leading field trips at GSA. We find them trying to publish papers in legitimate peer-reviewed journals. And we find a lot of the young Earth creationist efforts focused on the Grand Canyon. I think one reason they do this is the exposure. The Grand Canyon is one of the most visited places in the world. It gets about 5 million visitors per year. In fact, too many. You see this on the North Rim there. You're like, oh boy, yeah, I love all the nature. I just have to push all these people away in front of me to see it. Like if you've ever seen Old Faithful, when it goes off, because there's like a time, right? In between the outbursts at Old Faithful and Yellowstone, just sort of a few people meandering around, maybe a bison or something, and then 5 minutes before, there's just this rush of people that come. You're like, where did all of these people come from? It sort of doesn't have that nature-y feel. Anyway, so I think another reason they push for the young Earth creationist interpretation is that in the Grand Canyon especially, is that it gives them an opportunity to push and to challenge church-state separation. Now, this book, Tom Vale's book, Grand Canyon, A Different View. I wonder what that different view is. This book is it's mostly a picture book with quotes from the Bible. And I guess you could say it, I don't know what you could say about it. I mean, I've sort of flipped through it. It's not really saying much about the geology other than, isn't all this wonderful, and here's a quote from Psalms and so and so. But the publishers of this, and Tom Vale, as creationist, really wanted to get this in the Grand Canyon's bookstore. And the organization which runs the bookstore was somewhat resistant, as you might imagine, to this overtly religious tract. It would be sort of unlike anything else they had there. And it took actually a directive from the Bush administration to order them to put this in the bookstore. And this was hugely contentious, you might imagine. I snapped this picture of it in the North Rim bookstore, and I got to tell you, I had to look for it. And all the books there, I was like, okay, where is it? I know it's here. It was like on the very bottom shelf in, I don't know, it was not in the science section. So that at least was encouraging. And man, if that had been front center in the science section, like, oh man, it's all over. So it's that sort of church-state separation that they use, that they think the Grand Canyon can be a great place to kind of push that issue. Now, it's not so hard to push that issue, really, because if you go around the South Rim, you'll see plaques like these. O Lord, how manifold are thy works. And this is from Psalms here. So you can see already some church-state separation issues going on with this national park. And I can only imagine the furor that would be created. I can only imagine Bill O'Reilly blowing a gasket if they had put a quote from the Quran. That would, it's okay if it's this, but not the other side. No. That's not really how the law is supposed to work, and you're not really supposed to have plaques from one particular religious view in a neutral setting, but nonetheless, that's the issue, that's the contention. They really think this is a good place to push that issue, to bring, for instance, the young Earth creationist view into what the Rangers have to say to people. Can they, as Rangers, talk about an interpretation that's millions of years old? Or do they have to say, but some people believe this is only 10,000 years old? Which view gets told? And how do Rangers react when visitors challenge them on the standard geology, on the old view? How are Rangers instructed to react? These are all sort of issues that come up in the Grand Canyon, and this pushing of church and state is something they're very eager to do in this context. So, what do the creationists claim? Excuse me. I think I need a bit more of that beer. So what do these creationists claim? Let's say one of their main claims here, one of the main things that they push consistently is that the age of the Earth is wrong, that the techniques geologists use of radiometric dating are simply mistaken, and that scientists think the Earth is millions and millions of years old, but they know it's actually much younger. They push the idea of a sudden worldwide flood, and they think they can find in the rocks of the Grand Canyon evidence of that flood. They think that they can see evidence of mass death, because part of the Noah's flood model is that most everything on the planet dies all at once. So that should produce a lot of bodies, a lot of fossils in layers that it would be convenient for them if it was all the same layer. But they have interpretations for why these different types of fossils have sorted out into different layers. We interpret that as evolution. Yeah, time, but anyway. They also want to argue for rapid sediment deposition, for sediments that are depositing in days rather than millions of years. And they want to argue that the recession of waters carves the Grand Canyon. This last point is sort of a subtlety. Now, most people think, when they think of what do creationists say about the Grand Canyon? They say, well, Noah's flood carved the Grand Canyon. It's not quite right. Noah's flood, in their view, deposited these flat layers of rocks. And then after Noah's flood, as the water was pulling back into the oceans, that process carved the canyon. So it's a subtlety. You can impress a creationist that you know that. They say, oh, have you read Steve Austin's book? No. But I know someone who has, Steve Newton, and I have actually read his book, which, I don't know, maybe some sort of mark of distinction. I read all of Ray Comfort's tracts in his thing, too, about Darwin and evolution when he published his own version of The Origin of Species, and that I severely lost some brain cells with that. So, this picture shows our rafts here, our NCSE rafts, those 35-foot things kind of dwarfed by the scale here. And look at that black flow down the middle of this canyon. That black flow is lava. And if you sample that lava, it will actually come in at an older date than the rocks that it's flowing over. Puzzling. Wait a second, does it have to be younger? Doesn't this lava, which is flowing from a volcano shortly on the top of the rim there, doesn't it have to be younger than the rocks it's flowing over? Well, geologists have studied these rocks. They have sampled these. They've written papers about why this is so anomalously old. And the reason is that this lava has a lot of chunks of much older rock in it. It's kind of like this. If you have chunks of older rock that are carried along into lava, then you grind up all the lava and try and date it. What will be produced is a rock that is anomalously old, that is not right, because of these pre-existing chunks. Now, that's what the scientific papers say. They look at this and they talk about these lava flows and say, aha, these are pitfalls in radiometric dating. These are pitfalls in the way we determine the age of the Earth. You shouldn't sample rocks like this, or you should be very careful if you do, because you could get the wrong date because of these chunks. I think of it by analogy to a soup. You can make all sorts of nice things for a soup, leeks and potatoes. You can spend a lot of time boiling it, and then you put in rotten meat. The whole thing's ruined. The whole thing's ruined here. What would you guess that they ignore when talking about this? They ignore that the papers written about these lava flows, about these dating problems, actually are pointing to this as a pitfall for dating. And the conclusion the creationists take from this is that radiometric dating itself is broken. That you can't know the age of the rocks. And look, here are the Darwinists, they're putting in their own papers, they're admitting these dates are wrong. Like, yeah, we're admitting the dates are wrong if you don't understand how to sample this correctly. That's unexpectedly bright. Now, they point to a paper here from 1968. They love this paper. It's a paper that was published in the Journal of Geophysical Research by Funkhäuser and Naughton, July 15th, 1968, and they say, aha, here's the proof that the Darwinists know radiometric dating is broken. And what this is about is the same thing as the lava in Hawaii. It's about ultramafic inclusions in a young lava flow, pieces of old rock that are brought along. And it's the same sort of thing. We have in this recent lava flow, we know the date of chunks of rock that if you sample those chunks of rock will tell you the age of the flow is millions and millions of years older than we actually know it to be. This is a methodological paper. This tells you if you are sampling, watch out for this pitfall. Now, this doesn't mean radiometric dating as an enterprise is broken. And yet they point to this and say, aha, here's the proof. Here's the proof the scientists know the age of the Grand Canyon is wrong. Well, not quite. So they point to certain areas of the rock as showing rocks that they think were made during the week of creation. Here we see these igneous rocks in the very basement of the Grand Canyon rocks, like the Zoroaster granite and the Vishnu schist. And they say these are from day 3, separating the water from the earth, that sort of thing. This is primary rock, they think, that was made in creation week. I mean, I try and imagine it as I'm floating through here, what their perspective is. It really must be just mind-blowing if one thinks in this way, to actually see rocks from creation week. It must be really something else for them to touch these and have that sort of feeling. Unfortunately, of course, the reality is somewhat different. We see some more of these guys here, kind of twisted and folded. These rocks have been around a lot. These rocks are some of the oldest in the Grand Canyon. Now, on top of these primary rocks, on top of these rocks made from day 3, we have a little bit of sediment that was between creation and, Adam and Eve and all that sort of thing. A little bit of sediment. But in their model then, on top of those primary rocks, we have the flood. This massive worldwide flood unleashed upon the world. And I think they have some pretty good art from it here. I kind of like that. Whoa, that's dramatic. So what this is doing in the creationist model is scouring those day 3 rocks, eroding the top of them, and breaking up all the other rocks which had been deposited since since creation week. Now they kind of focus on a lot of this, strangely, I think, on all the people outside, all the people who weren't on the ark. They have these beautiful pictures of the ark. Nowhere in the water there do you see the millions of dead babies who drowned. They sort of have a skewed perspective on that, and I kind of wonder, it's like, does the artist on this think the people being drowned there were all bad people? Is it 100% bad? I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing. I wonder why they focus on this so much. And then, as I was thinking about this, I found this picture from a panel art, from a mosaic, not a mosaic, from a diorama at the Creation Museum. Look at this. Okay. Here we see the ark floating by, and we see people who have found this last little spit of land before everything gets swallowed. And we see people further down there. And look down here. Tigers. Man, you can imagine what these people felt. They were like, okay, I woke up this morning, I was going to work, I noticed it was raining a lot. And then all of a sudden, there's this flood and I find myself swimming. And I'm just like, oh man, this is terrible. I'm totally going to be late for work. And luckily I found this spit of rock and there's a bunch of other people there. And I go up and I hear this, rawr. I go, oh man, could this day get any worse? So it's a little excessive, the tigers, I think. And you kind of wonder, the ark floating by there, what are they thinking about that? They're like, is that a boat? how did this happen? Noah's kind of waving out of the window, they're going, suckers. So it's a very strange view here. But this is what they think is a literal fact, a literal thing happening, and of course affecting the rocks underneath. Now, one idea that they hold is that when critters were facing this flood, when tigers and lizards and such were trying to scamper away, they left traces in the rock that showed them madly trying to escape this flood. And they actually point to traces such as this. You can see the little feet marks in this and say this is evidence of animals trying to escape the flood. Can you see a problem with that? As real geologic evidence? Yeah, you kind of can't make a footprint in anything other than soft mud. And so the idea that this animal was madly escaping the flood and then somehow this very soft sediment was preserved in this tsunami-like surge of water, it strikes me as a little strange, a little inconsistent geologically. Now they like to point to the idea of mass death, mass burials. And they point to critters such as these. We call these nautiloids. The long cone-like thing there is a nautiloid. And here are some of these nautiloids fossilized. There's actually a nautiloid canyon in the Grand Canyon. And one thing that Steve Austin has done is taken people with research permits, I should point out, the National Park Service has given him permits to do research like this, and they've measured the orientation of these nautiloids. And from that, they've extrapolated that there was a direction to the way these were oriented. And therefore, there must have been a gigantic flood. It's a bit of a strange thing. I mean, he's sampling something like a dozen of these in a relatively small area and extrapolating out to something worldwide from this. It's really a bit much. And the fact is, with these sort of shells, once these critters die and fall to the ocean floor, it doesn't take a flood, which we think of as being very turbulent, very mixed all different directions, but just a gradual laminar current will align these sort of things. It doesn't require anything extraordinary. Now, here you see Jeannie and Alan Gishlick standing next to what they think is the actual spot where the Great Flood scoured away those Day 3 rocks. Below, by their ankles, are Day 3 rocks created primarily, and above that is sediment that's deposited once the flood waters stopped. And the scour line is right by Jeannie's waist there, the scour line of the Great Flood itself. Here you see it. Two creationists who go to the Grand Canyon, they put their hands on that and they think they're actually touching Noah's flood. Now, after the flood happens, there's a year where Noah is floating around, kind of going, okay, enough with the rain, let's get back to land. And during that year, we're having the deposition of a lot of sediment. That's the creationist model. This flood year deposits all sorts of sediment. And the flat layers of the Grand Canyon, most of what we see in the Grand Canyon in the creationist model is happening at this time. This is when we get all those flat-lying sediments, things such as this, that people go to the rim of the Grand Canyon, look out and go, oh, look at all the grandeur. And that's what they're seeing, these flat-lying sediments, which to the creationist eye is the flood year deposits. All of that, except the stuff right in the very bottom there, they think is deposited in 1 year. Most of the layers deposited in a day or two, and then maybe a pause, and then another layer formed. Very, very rapid. This is one of our camps we set up here, and it gives you an idea. Here we see our boats here. We tie those up. Tie those up pretty good. Don't want to lose those. And set up tents here in the sand. And these flat-lying rocks here, they think those all formed, that whole wall there would have formed in one big swoosh, one big push of sediment going across an entire continent. Remember, Steve Austin trying to argue for continent-wide deposition. Now, as the waters receded after the year, they cut into the canyon. And that's what we see here. We see incisement, but very, very rapidly and into soft sediment. So I don't know if there are any children present. Oh, yes, we might consider the children are going to leave for a moment here because I'm going to say something shocking. All of these ideas, all of these things that the creationists have proposed for this can be described by one shocking word. I'm afraid to say the awful truth is none of what they claim is right. Not really even one portion of it. So let's detail where they go wrong. So they claim radiometric dating is flawed. Well, I've worked at the United States Geological Survey in a job dealing with these sort of machines, these mass spectrometers. I can tell you that the technique of doing this is extremely precise. It is extremely difficult to do, and there are all sorts of checks and balances to make sure that it is done right. That, in fact, when you run a set of samples, maybe every 10th sample is run as a standard. It's something that you know the value of so that you can see if it's a machine drifting one way or the other, and then you correct for that. This is not a haphazard thing that geologists do. This is one of the most precise things that geologists do. And the idea here that radiometric dating itself is flawed methodologically just simply flies in the face of some really good research. It really relies too on selective sampling. Remember, I talked about these lava flows with these chunks of other things in them. Well, if you're a creationist and you go up to those lava flows and sample the chunk, yeah, you're going to get a rock that is anomalously old. But you're also going to be ignoring peer-reviewed research that has been published on this saying you shouldn't do that. So it's an extremely selective view for the argument that radiometric dating is wrong. Nobody else seems to think there's a problem. The worldwide flood idea. The truth, geologically, is that most rock units are very localized. True, there are some, and some in the Grand Canyon, that spread over, let's say, a state. We can find it spreading throughout a state as being relatively the same. But on the longer scale, as you try and put that into the content, oh, thank you very much. You know what would be great would be a table if we had that here. So most rocks are very, very localized. And they talk about these erosional surfaces. Here you see this erosional surface being outlined, these day 3 rocks with the flood deposits on top of them. You know, I'm sorry, that doesn't take an exceptional flood. That doesn't take a worldwide flood to happen. That's very, very common to see in the geologic literature. Very, very common to see in outcrops. It just doesn't require a huge worldwide flood to explain. Those animal tracks, when we talked about those being very delicate, you can't make foot impressions from a little lizard scampering up a slope in something that is hard rock. And so this soft rock was gently preserved over a long time. It didn't have a tsunami of water follow it. The animal wasn't scampering or trying to get away. The animal was just doing what animals always do. Walking up a slope, leaving some muddy footprints behind. Nothing unusual, nothing spectacular. That, I'm sad to say, for their model is the unfortunate and kind of mundane truth. They talk about these mass burials. But what they ignore is the fact that, well, I wouldn't say ignore. What they dismiss is the idea that the fossils in the Grand Canyon vary quite distinctly by layer. The lower layers have certain fossils that goes higher and higher up, and they change. In other words, they evolve. We can see evolution happening in the change of fossils over time in the rocks of the Grand Canyon. And yet for them, all these animals had to be living at the same time, and yet somehow never get buried in the same layer together. They're all buried in different layers. They try and explain it by density, saying that maybe some of the critters fell more rapidly through the water column after they died, but it's just not true. You just look at organisms and say, well, there's not that much density difference, and wouldn't the waters have to be really, really calm for them to fall like that? And we're talking here about huge sheets of sediment going across a whole continent in a day, laying down these flat layers. There's some serious inconsistencies here. They talk about the alignment of these nautiloids. Steve Austin has research where he's really touting this, and the alignment of critters like this is not an uncommon geologic feature. This is something, in fact, every introductory geology student studies. You go out and look at a layer of clamshells that are all sort of aligned the same way, and you say, oh, look, there must have been a current going this way. Not a worldwide flood, which would be turbulent and violent and mixed up. Just a smooth laminar current, 3 or 4 miles an hour, is sufficient to align these sorts of things. Now, Steve Austin says, and here we see this death layer, this mass death layer. He extrapolates and says we have billions and billions of nautiloids. Well, I've been to the little ledge on which he made these measurements, and it's less wide than this room. It's actually pretty narrow, and it's maybe a little longer than this room. So we're talking here a small little ledge with a bunch of these nautiloid fossils, and from that one ledge he extrapolates over hundreds of square miles. I think literally it's like this. They take a 1 meter square grid and say, okay, in that 1 meter square grid we found 3 nautiloids. Therefore, we must have that same ratio throughout all of Arizona. It's really quite a claim. Now, this idea of this mass, violent death of almost everything on the planet also preserves a lot of fossils which are quite delicate. Here we see a crinoid stem. This is in a big cave I'll show you here in a moment. These tiny little layers on this guy, they like to disarticulate, and often geologists see them as little discs, kind of like lifesavers that are spread apart. This one's intact, so that's telling me that it wasn't in such a violent, roiling water. It was laid down kind of gently. So this violent mass death suddenly happening all at once is really inconsistent with what we see on the ground. Here we see a stem of a critter that is kind of holding onto the seafloor bottom. This is what we call a holdfast. Very delicate. How's that going to get preserved in a worldwide flood, a violent tsunami-like event? Here we see worm burrows. I don't think we're going to get too many of those preserved in soft sediment if we have this tsunami-like happening. Delicate creatures. So they also talk about rapid sediment deposition. For the creationist model to work, you have to deposit all the rocks of the Grand Canyon in 1 year. Well, look at this bottom layer. You see those nice lines in it? Those lines are not something you'd expect from jumbled up rocks. If this was a roiling layer of sediment that deposited very quickly and had a lot of energy to it, I don't think you'd see those kind of lines. You'd see something that was more mixed up. We geologists can, after all, go to a tsunami deposit and see what that actually looks like, and go to Indonesia and see what do rocks look like when they're deposited by a huge wave. It ain't like that. We see here a bunch of somewhat fine laminations, fine layers. And how did these get preserved in this violent, cataclysmic event? We see surfaces between these layers that are clearly erosional. Now imagine that Steve Austin is right, and that the creationist model is what happened, and we have a huge influx of sediment sweeping across a continent. Would the top of that be completely flat? You see how the boundary between these is just a razor-sharp line? Is that how that would be? No, I suspect it would be rippled and undulated. It would be quite quite an uneven surface if that model were true. So what we're seeing here, to the geologist's eye, is a typical erosional surface. You have a flat surface, maybe under some sort of shallow water, some rivers or something that's just cutting it flat like sandpaper. A little bit over time, that's cutting this down flat. That's not the creationist model, what we're seeing there. Apparently, I'm getting a phone call. Let me stop that. The American Red Cross. They want my blood. Here we see another one of these surfaces, very sharp and distinct. And this contact between the Coconino Sandstone, I'll have more to say on that in a second, and the Hermit Formation, very sharp. It's razor sharp. You can see it throughout the canyon. Here it is from the north rim. You can put a knife edge on that. That's not what we'd expect to see if we have huge rapid deposition that's forming over a very short period of time. Now, one of their claims is that the floodwaters receding carved the canyon. But in fact, normal processes are quite sufficient to carve the canyon. This is what the water looks like towards the end of the trip. It's got a lot of sediment in it. People say, well, how did the Grand Canyon get carved by all that water? This is how. These little particles are being carried out by the stream, and you start off pretty clear in the water, and it becomes more and more muddy as you go closer and closer to Lake Mead. This is the process that carved the Grand Canyon happening right here. Now, they claim that in order for the water to have cut the Grand Canyon as it receded, all the rocks had to be pretty soft. They weren't hardened into rock yet. They were mud. Have you ever been able to make mud that steep? And have you ever been able to take a bridge of mud, you see that little bridge in the middle there, and stack that mud over and expect it to hold? I mean, it only weighs, I'm guessing, 100 tons. There are things in the canyon that are very incompatible with this idea of soft sediment deposition over a rapid period of time. What they are consistent with is this being slowly eroded as the rock is already hardened. In other words, the normal geologic model. Here we see a deposit which to normal eyes might not seem like much, but to the geologist's eyes looks rather interesting. The Temple Butte Formation sits in carved mauve limestone here. The mauve limestone about 505 million years ago. The Temple Butte about 385. Excuse me. The Redwall limestone about 340 million years ago. And to the geologist's eye, this sort of structure is a river that was meandering around a flat plain in the mauve limestone. They got filled in with the Temple Butte. And how do you get a meandering river that's cut perpendicular by what's the Colorado River? It doesn't make sense for that sort of structure to exist if this was all deposited in 1 year. This is in the middle of the rocks that the creationists point to as formed during the year of Noah's flood. But I've outlined a number of problems here with the creationist model. Not surprisingly, it's got some problems, but I've saved the best for last. There's a huge problem for them, and it's called the Coconino Sandstone. Now, to almost every geologist, the Coconino Sandstone is a classic example of what we call an aeolian deposit, a deposit made in dry desert conditions. And the Coconino sits right here. The Toroweap Formation, the Kaibab Formation above it, both of those were laid down in water. The Hermit Shale laid down in water. The Mauve Limestone laid down in water. The Bright Shale laid down in water. All of these layers here, these flat-lying layers, I'm sure this gives the creationists some hope, tend to be what we think of as rocks that are formed underwater, with one exception, and it sits right in the middle of this stack of rocks. How could we have a desert deposit in the middle of this global flood? And then more deposits on top of that. It doesn't really make sense for them. This Coconino Sandstone, these cross-bedded layers here, is a thing that displays all sorts of classic features. We see a kind of a frosting to the grains that looks like glass that's been sandblasted. That's what you see in a desert environment. These crossbeds, that's what you see in a desert environment. This is classic terrestrial desert aeolian deposition, and it sits right in the middle of their flood model. Now, John Morris, the person I mentioned earlier, the president of ICR, he says this, and I'm glad he admits this. It is hard to imagine how a desert deposit would develop during the flood. It really is. But instead of coming to the conclusion that, well, maybe we should re-examine our model of this flood, they try and explain it away. And one of the main ways that creationists have infiltrated the Geological Society of America meetings is to attack the Coconino Sandstone, to try and interpret it as something other. Here are some abstracts. It's won by a fellow named John Whitmore, who was one of the leaders on that trip, who teaches at Cedarville University. Cedarville University is a Christian university that, in its mission statement, affirms a 6-day literal young earth perspective, moreover, which requires all its faculty to sign that mission statement. This paper is about textural trends in the Coconino Sandstone. Interesting. We see a paper here, again with John Whitmore as a co-author, widespread dolomite in the Coconino Sandstone. And look at this. Most workers have interpreted the Coconino as Aeolian, which makes these findings surprising. Most workers have interpreted this. But we have a different view. That's what this is about. And they don't come out and explicitly say it. They don't cite Psalms. They don't cite biblical verses here. What they're doing is subtly trying to undermine the idea of the Aeolian of the Coconino as Aeolian, because they can't stomach it. It doesn't work for their model. Textural analysis of the Coconino Sandstone. Again, Cedarville University. Can compaction account for lower than expected crossbed dips in the Coconino Sandstone? Large-scale crossbedding in sandstones is often interpreted as Aeolians. However, ... Again, trying to undermine this idea. That's where the current cutting-edge science, that's where the current efforts are for them. And they try and make these in peer-reviewed conferences in such a way that then they can cite this and say, look, we've had a paper accepted by the evolutionists. They've heard our model, and I stood out there by my poster and nobody said anything. We must be right. Unusual bedding styles for the Coconino Sandstone. It's one after another. The Coconino Sandstone typically contains Vadiata, often interpreted as Aeolian dunes. However, we report, you see the pattern here? It's just, if you go to the GSA and go to a paper on the Coconino Sandstone, chances are it's a creationist paper. Now, this is really disheartening to me in some ways, because there are tremendous mysteries still to be understood about the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon fits in this area called the Colorado Plateau, a huge area of rocks that have been flatly laid down and then lifted up almost without distortion. Now here in California, you lift up the rocks, you get tremendous distortion. Why was this lifted up? And the north rim of the Grand Canyon is like 8,000 feet above sea level. I mean, really lifted up. How did this get lifted up in flat, intact layers without distortion? No one knows. I mean, people have ideas, but this is an area for scientific research. They're not interested in that. How does an arid region like this have so much water eroded features? How did this big cavern get eroded by an area that gets not that many inches of rain per year? How did this river's path, the Colorado River, comes down here and it basically ignores faults? Most rivers follow along faults. The Colorado just cuts perpendicular across them, just doesn't even deal with them. Why is that a feature here? Geologists would like to know. This is a mystery. They're not interested in those questions. We look at this river here, and any Geology 101 student, which maybe some of mine will be asked this question, will look at these little barbs coming off of the main river and say, aha, these always V towards the direction of the river. See how that's angling in like that? So if I ask them, which way is this river flowing, top to bottom or bottom to top, they're going to say, oh, well, look at the barbs here. It's obviously flowing bottom to top. But not the Colorado. It's actually flowing this way. It's flowing opposite the direction of the tributaries. And this is a weird mystery. They're pointing the wrong direction. Why did that happen? The creationists aren't interested in those kind of questions. We look at the geologic column here in the Grand Canyon, and it seems like a long time. It seems like, a lot of millions of years of deposits. But when you add them up, there's actually much more time missing than is actually present there. What happened to the rest of that? Was it never deposited? Was it eroded? These are fascinating questions. They have no heart for those kind of questions. They're not interested. And so it seems to me, to wrap up, that they're really missing the joy of science. They're really missing pursuing these kind of questions. They're trying to undermine the Coconino Sandstone in its proper, typical interpretation and find some little, oh, look, it's got a little bit more dolomite. Oh, look, the angle of the bedding is different. It's ridiculous. They're missing the big picture, and they're missing, I think, frankly, the joy of science. Thank you very much.